Welcome everyone to the reviews of the Enoch Seminar virtual book review session. My name is Dr. Joshua Scott. I'm the interim chief editor of the RES. We're very pleased to welcome you to this virtual review where we will discuss Jason A. Staples' new book, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, a new theory of people, exile, and Israelite identity. RES is a digital review service of the Enoch Seminar that publishes quarterly reviews of recent books. In service for over 10 years, the Review Journal distributes high-quality reviews that target works significant to our field of research, including works on the Hebrew Bible, pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, Qumran scrolls, as well as Christian rabbinic and Islamic literature. If you have recently published a book or would like to consider reviewing books for us, please contact me by email. This review is our last review of the 2022 season. We have 4 reviews scheduled for 2023, one each quarter. And so we invite you to stay connected to the RES through the Enoch Seminar webpage and Facebook page. If you have not already done so, please consider becoming a member of the Enoch Seminar to support events such as this review. I'll drop the webpage information and my email address in the chat soon. Before we begin our session, we also recognize our partners in today's event, the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies, and Cambridge University Press. Thank you for your support of the Enoch Seminar and Jason Staples research. I'm pleased to chair today's session. The review session will begin with a brief overview by Jason of his book. We will then hear reviews from Doctors Al Baumgarten, Jackie Weiss-Rhodes, Gabriele Boccaccini, and Mark Lucier. Unfortunately, Mark is not able to join us in person today, but I will share Mark's pre-recorded review in due course. Following these reviews, we will take a 5-minute break and then open the floor for discussion between the speakers and participants. To focus our time on the book, we will only offer very short introductions to today's speakers. We encourage all participants to engage the conversation through Zoom's chat function. Once we move to open discussion, we will also invite participants to use the raised hand feature if they would like to join us on screen to engage the speakers directly. With those brief announcements, we are now pleased to begin with a brief introduction to the book by Jason Staples, Assistant Teaching Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at NC State University. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And again, thank you so much for all of your hard work putting this together. And thanks also to those of you who are doing reviews. I'm very much appreciative of your willingness to take time out and do this. This means a lot to me. So thank you very much for that. So to introduce the basics of this book, I think it's probably best to go back to where kind of it came from. And that goes back actually to an undergrad prophets survey class back in 2003, where I wound up doing a term paper on Jeremiah. And the thing that I noticed was the promise of a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And I just couldn't shake that part, the fact that the new covenant prophecy continues to differentiate between Israel and Judah over a century after the destruction of the northern kingdom. And I also knew that in the New Testament, the new covenant prophecy was interpreted as including Gentiles, which then seemed very strange to me in the context of the promise being to Israel and to Judah, and it doesn't mention Gentiles. So that really is what launched this research project in which I wanted to pull on those threads until I got into something a little more concrete. And ultimately I kept pulling out that thread and kept finding that the near universal presumption that the categories Israelite and Jew are coextensive or synonymous in the Second Temple period, just that didn't hold up. And I also noticed that most scholarship in the 20th century on this material did recognize that these terms were not actually used interchangeably in this period, but to explain that everybody seemed to default to Carl Kuhn's TWNT 1930s era TWNT insider-outsider paradigm, in which Kuhn says that Israelite is the preferred insider designation, while Jew, or Yehudim, was an outsider term that sometimes took on a contemptuous or depreciatory nuance, but then was accommodated by Jews themselves in outsider contexts. But scholars like Shia Cohen and especially Maurice Casey, which, if you haven't looked up his response to this, that article is well worth reading just for the snark, had already noticed that there was no evidence of the depreciatory context or nuance of Jew in the Second Temple period that Kuhn had mentioned. And Kuhn himself didn't list any evidence for it in his article, so he just presumed that. And so that suggested that the model had pretty significant holes. And as I kept digging, I kept finding scholarship on individual texts from the Second Temple period that kept presenting that specific work, whatever was being worked on in that moment, as an exception to what the scholar of that text assumed was the norm in the Second Temple period. And that ultimately suggested, they would then conclude that this text or that one or whatever one was being worked on had a different view of Israel from the norm. So ultimately, I concluded that someone needed to put those pieces all together to provide a bigger picture look that demonstrated that these were not actually individual exceptions, but were actually part of a larger pattern that illustrated that the modern assumption that Israelite and Jew were synonymous categories in this period, that assumption was mistaken. And so after working through as much material from the period as I could find, I wound up coming to two major conclusions, which then became the central theses of the book. And that's first, that throughout the Second Temple period, the category of Jews, that is Yehudim, Yehudioi, that category is consistently treated as a subset of Israel, specifically the subset derived from the southern tribes associated with the kingdom of Judah, rather than treated as the whole of Israel, which many modern scholars had assumed previously. So in the words of Gary Knoppers, Judah did not in fact become Israel, or to paraphrase him slightly, Judah did not in fact become Israel in the Second Temple period. And what that means then is Jews are Israelites, but Israel by definition also throughout this period includes non-Jewish Israelites not associated with Judah. And perhaps the most obvious category that fits that description, or at least self-identifies as that description, would be the Samaritans, who are not Jews, but definitely claim Israelite status and heritage, though that, of course, was disputed by at least some Jews. And then the second thesis is that the relationship between these two terms and these two categories is maintained throughout the Second Temple period, largely because of the persistence of a biblical theological tradition that I, borrowing from E.P. Sanders, call restoration eschatology. And this restoration eschatology is constructed through the biblical texts, and then I argue maintained through much other literature in the period, in that this restoration eschatology consistently, though with all sorts of variations on the how, I mean, there's tons of variation, as you would expect, in terms of the how, consistently anticipate the restoration of all 12 tribes of Israel promised in the prophets, which is then understood as not yet having happened. So the returns of Ezra and Nehemiah are a partial, but not the complete fulfillment of this restoration. And then this restoration is still expected at some time in the future, when the rest of Israel and the Jewish portion of Israel, that is the part from Judah, are all restored together and elevated and above the nations, et cetera, that this is a pretty common expectation, again, with lots of variation within that larger framework. So ultimately, I think this represents a pretty significant shift in scholarship. So the real task then was demonstrating these theses persuasively. And how well I've done on that is ultimately really not my decision. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing and hearing what you all think after working through the evidence that I have presented. And for that, I turn it over to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now welcome Dr. Al Baumgarten, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Jewish History at Bar-Ilan University. Al, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
I can't, but it's okay. I think I know what's on it.
We actually
okay.
can't see the PowerPoint.
You can't.
Yeah, we see
No.
emails. So that I think it's the wrong part of the screen that's been shared. So,
1 second, I will try again, okay? Yep. How about this?
Same one.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Now
there
you see the PowerPoint.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, like I said before, I'm klutzy at this stuff. Unfortunately, my grandchildren are not here this evening. Let me begin. Let's see. Right. My colleague and friend, Ed Sanders, whom Jason just mentioned, died 29 days ago, November 21st, after suffering from progressive dementia for over 5 years. The picture on the screen is from June of 2021, about a little more than a year ago, and it shows Ed in his pandemic best, not having been to the barber for quite some time. I want to say something personal about Ed and his life, then bring his academic legacy into the discussion of Jason's book. So the personal. Those of you who knew Ed or who just read the last paragraph of the preface to Paul and Palestinian Judaism carefully recognize that he did not have an easy life. It was filled with trauma, sadness, and depression. His wife, Becky, also known as Rebecca Gray, author of Prophetic Figures in Late Second Temple Jewish Palestine, wrote to me that in the end, he died in peace and at peace with himself. As someone who shared some of Ed's most difficult years, I find some consolation in that information, in at peace with himself. A quotation from Ed's work is the epigraph to the conclusions chapter of the book under review, and his analysis of the evidence is noted at several stages of the argument. So his academic legacy is also in play in what we will do today, discussing Jason's book. Jason's objective is to offer a paradigm that provides the connecting link between virtually all the sources we know concerning the Jews of antiquity. He intends his paradigm to stand alongside or to be analogous to that offered by Sanders, who proposed covenantal nomism or common Judaism as the critical connecting link, as what Ed called the basic concept. Some of you may like it better if I say it in German, Grundbegriff, that stands behind numerous different texts, even when that basic concept is not noted explicitly. Staples explicitly quotes the approach championed by Sanders at the beginning of his book as a model for his own work, page 5, quoting Paul and Palestinian Judaism. According to Staples, the basic concept has two interrelated parts, and we've already heard him mention that. First, distinguish when Israel refers to the northern kingdom of the First Temple period, and when it refers to all Israel, the 12 tribes, son of Jacob. Contrary to what is assumed as self-evident by too many scholars, Israel is rarely, if ever, Judaioi, conventionally Jews, or only a part of the larger Israel. Once Israel is defined that way, it has consequences for the vision of the eschaton. A restoration eschatology looms over Israel in almost all its varieties. A fundamental component of that eschaton is the practically impossible vision of restoration of the exiles of the northern kingdom, what we call the 10 lost tribes. This hope makes any restoration which has taken place incomplete. All Israel always remains under the curse of punishment for sins committed in the past and in exile. Wherever one is for the moment, No matter how good it may seem, it is not yet Israel in the full sense of the word. I find the paradigm constructed by the two parts of this basic concept especially insightful in understanding the case of the Samaritans, and it is not an accident that both Jason in his remarks and I intend to focus on that. Point A, the inscription from Delos makes explicit the way they define themselves as Israel. The Israelites in Delos will make offerings to holy Har Gerizim. On the other side of the divide, Ben Sira, 50:25-26, dismissed the Samaritans, reflecting the Jewish perception of them. Two nations I detest, and the third is no nation at all. The inhabitants of Mount Seir, the Philistines, and the senseless folk, I stress that live at Shechem. B'shnei goyim katzan nafshi, v'shlishit einenu am. Yoshvei Seir ufleshet, v'goy naval, we'll be coming back to that term, Hadar B'Shechem. They are a foolish people, not even worthy of being called a nation. Ben Sira was echoing Deuteronomy 32:21. I'll incense them with a no folk, the goy naval achisem. Jason's analysis of the Samaritan also sheds light on 4Q 372, the prayer of Joseph from Qumran. The real Joseph is in exile in strange lands, praying for his suffering to end and for God to redeem him. Meanwhile, foreign impostors, Nivalim, guess who, have built themselves an altar on a high mountain. They vex Israel, blaspheme the tent of Zion with lies, angering Levi, Judah, and Benjamin. When the divine redemption comes for the real Joseph, he will offer sacrifices of gratitude. In addition to the critique of the Samaritans, Thyssen sees in this text a reminder to the Judeans in the south that their redemption is not complete, so long as the northern tribes remain in exile. Paleographically, 4Q 372 was copied during the Hasmonean era, and one is entitled to wonder, following Thyssen, if this text was intended as a reaction against the temptation of the Hasmonean dynasty to proclaim that the grand finality of the eschaton was already indicated by events in which they took a leading role. Consider a passage such as 1 Maccabees 14, 4-15, a text in which virtually every single phrase is a millennial allusion of one sort or other, and an indication that maybe we're supposed to believe that we're already in the grand finale. I'll save the time of reading it and leave you to read it yourselves while I continue to speak. Maybe I'll just stop for a minute so you can have a chance to read it. Fourth, Staples pointing to the Samaritans in his context provides a double reason for the destruction of the Mount Gerizim temple by John Hyrcanus. That temple can be considered an idolatrous implant in the land of Israel. They're not really Israelites, the Samaritans, as we saw, to be obliterated as Josiah did to the foreign cults, according to 2 Kings. At the same time, however, its worshippers claim to be Israelites and worship Yahweh. The same holidays are celebrated there, and the Torah, at least in their version, is their guide to life. The Samaritans could or should thus be authentically included in Sanders' category of covenantal nomists. But all this is too close to comfort for the Hasmonean leaders of the temple in Jerusalem. When they have the power and opportunity, they destroy the Gerizim temple. My point number 4, how far does this paradigm extend? Does it include the Dead Sea Scrolls? Staples, following Gerksma, insists it does. I quote him, in the end, it should suffice to say that the Pesharim provide no reason to doubt the centrality of Israelite restoration eschatology and the related distinction between Judah and Israel that we have found elsewhere in the scrolls, page 283, if you want to look it up. On this point, I have to confess that I have my doubts. In the limited context here, I will discuss only one source, 4Q Pesher Nachum. The context there is local. The ongoing differences between the sect and the Dorshei Chalakot, the seekers after smooth things, usually identified as the Pharisees. Within this narrow horizon, the complaint against the seekers is extensive, but Jerusalem-based. They invited the Seleucid king Demetrius to Jerusalem. They are identified with Ephraim as schematics, who may run things, but do so brutally. They mislead concerning the proper way to observe the Torah, and all levels of the national leadership, down to converts, are led astray by their teaching. The crucial text for my purposes is fragment 3:4 on Nahum 3:5-9, and the text is now in front of you. The prophet in the verse that serves as the base text is talking to Jerusalem as a woman. V'hishlachti alayich shikutzim v'nivlatayich v'samtich cha'ora v'haya kol ro'ech yadudu mimech. I will cast filth upon you and treat you with contempt and render you despicable, so that all who look upon you shall flee from you. And now comes the interpretation. Pishro al dorshei chalakot asher b'acharit hakates yigalu ma'asehem hara'im l'chol Yisrael. V'rabim yavinu ba'avonam u'sinaum u'che'arum al zidon ashmatam. U'v'igalot kvod Yehuda yadudu. That's the verse that, word from the verse that he picks up. Pita'ei Ephraim mitoch kehalam, v'azvu et mita'ehem, v'nilvu al kol Yisrael. This concerns, I won't read the English. I assume it's enough to have in front of you. In particular, in this particular Jerusalem-focused horizon of rivalry between groups, especially for the loyalty of the simple, whom I would identify as the floaters between groups, trying out several possibilities before making a choice. Compare Josephus in his account at the beginning of his life. Israel does not make sense as the 12 tribes of Jacob. Rather, Israel stands for the Jews of the Hasmonean kingdom, whose capital was Jerusalem and the locus of the most intense sectarian rivalry. Israel suffers from the seekers, but will recognize the evil of the seekers at the end of days. The glory will shine then. Judah will set the standards. And I see this as the loyalty of the sect identified with Judah in the proper way of keeping the covenant will then be apparent, so that even the simple of Ephraim, who now follow the false teachings of the seekers, will join Israel, the Jews of the Hasmonean state, in the proper practice for which Judah was the trailblazer. Note, we are here at the end of days. The restoration is complete. Israel is Judah, and there is no sense of the curse of the exile. In fact, things could not be better. One thought and one question to Jason Staples to close. Thought. Even if I am right, and the Dead Sea Scrolls do not fit his paradigm, it does not invalidate the paradigm in other contexts. In the limited horizon of the world, as seen by sectarians, I think the pieces of the puzzle are to be arranged differently, but I don't think that invalidates arranging the pieces of the puzzle as he has done in the context, in almost all of the other contexts in which he wrote. And now my question. I had a look at your CV, Jason, and I see that you're planning a new book to be called Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, Jews, Former Gentiles, Israelites. And my question, what is the connection between the current book and the new one? Am I correct in thinking that the current book is preparation for the coming one? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Al. We now turn to Dr. Jackie Rice Rhodes, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Jason, for a compelling, convincing, and comprehensive investigation of the idea of Israel in Second Temple sources. I found this book to be an illuminating exploration of the assumptions and interpretive lenses modern scholars have brought to bear on our analysis of these sources. For those who haven't read it amongst us, I commend the book with enthusiasm. not only for its content, but also its engaging and even winsome writing style. The Idea of Israel was for me simply a pleasure to read. At the outset of these remarks, I want to say that I am largely convinced by the book's central thesis, especially that the terms Israelite, Jew, and Hebrew, quote, are neither synonymous nor coextensive in the Second Temple period, with each having its own specific nuance, overlapping with, but not identical to the meaning of the others. I am also convinced by the book's argument that references to Israel in Second Temple works imply and assume a framework of restoration eschatology, page 339 for more on that. My further comments are offered in the spirit of general affirmation and agreement with Jason, and in gratitude for the clarity his analysis offers. I'd like to highlight a couple of points made in chapter 3 of the book, and then ask a couple of questions. Chapter 3 is called Judah's Bible and Biblical Israel. And in this chapter, Jason writes that the Bible, quote, constructs, emphasizes, and idealizes a unified 12-tribe Israel and laments its broken present state, regularly depicting Judah as incomplete without its northern counterpart, page 92. He goes on pages 94 to 95 to say, at the root of exilic and post-exilic Judaism is not a redefinition of Israel limited to Judah or Jews, but restoration eschatology. As, quote, the theological conviction that Israel has fallen under the curses of the Lord's covenant and awaits a time of glorious redemption and restoration. In arguing for the prevalence of covenant-oriented restoration eschatology in Second Temple sources that talk about Israel, Staples is clear that he does not intend to argue for a homogeneous Judaism. Quote, not all Jews in the Second Temple period believe the same things, he writes. Rather, his analysis concludes that, quote, many but not all Second Temple period Jews advocated for restoration eschatology. Jason envisions a, quote, central grammar of discourse shared across various forms of Judaism, which includes both covenant and restoration eschatology. The rest of the book explores these claims in both great depth and breadth, with a remarkable number of examples supportive of Staples' claims. I would like to dedicate a portion of my remarks to pause for a moment to wonder about and consider the exceptions Jason allows for when he writes that many, but not all, Second Temple period Jews advocated for restoration eschatology. Which streams, I wonder, took exception to this expectation? Jason goes on to state that, quote, there remains no known Judaism in this period, wisdom, apocalyptic, or any other form outside a covenantal framework, page 97. So it's not the covenant part that offers some diversity, but the restoration eschatology part of his thesis. These statements together engage my curiosity. I wonder, were there streams of Judaism in this time period that did not espouse a restoration eschatology, but still maintain the covenantal framework? And how important is the Deuteronomic covenant in particular to restoration eschatology? In other words, I know it's very important in the examples Jason explores, but could a restoration eschatology be linked to other kinds of covenantal traditions? And are there texts which do this? I wonder whether other covenants might sometimes participate in this discourse. Now, Jason accounts for references to the Davidic covenant when a particular book's restoration eschatology includes explicit references to a restored kingship. Could the more universal covenantal language in Genesis be relevant here too? Does covenantal language have to be exclusive to Israel to play a role in or have a stake in the restoration of Israel? A related question, can a text be covenantal from this time period in some sense without being invested in restoration? As a case study, I wonder how some reflections on First Enoch might help us with these questions. Jason explores the animal apocalypse in chapter 5, particularly its depiction of a state of exile that is not resolved by the construction of the Second Temple, but rather extends until the final judgment. Outside of this analysis of the animal apocalypse, First Enoch rarely speaks directly or traditionally of covenant, though there is one mention of Sinai in the first chapter. Staples suggests in chapter 5 that the antediluvian setting of the book influences its reticence in such matters, and I agree that the book's literary setting does have significant explanatory power. But could the Enochic scribes also be among those who might speak with a different grammar, or at least a different dialect, than that of the restoration and covenant-oriented Second Temple sources? To be clear, I think that First Enoch does engage in what I consider to be covenantal language, but the kinds of covenants depicted are more frequently universal in scope and not restricted to humans, more similar to the post-flood covenant in Genesis, which makes sense given its literary context. An example is First Enoch 69 in the Book of the Parables, which presents a cosmic oath. Here, the cosmos enters into a contract with God with the following terms: the sea will not breach its boundaries of sand, the pillars will not be shaken, the sun and moon will not transgress their commands, and when God calls the names of the stars, each one will answer. In verse 25, the oath is said to preserve nature itself, as well as its paths and courses. The cosmos is thus God's contractual partner, a sort of natural vassal to God's suzerain creator status. The scribes have cast nature in a covenantal role, usually reserved for humans, and as such, the natural world is here presented as the ideal covenantal partner, perfectly obedient, perfectly reliable. And elsewhere, like First Enoch 2 through 5, humans are even adjured to contemplate and observe the natural world as a model for their own righteousness and obedience. The future First Enoch envisions is one that resonates with a rejuvenated earth, I think, more than a restored nation. So could this be an example of a textual tradition that is interested in covenant, but less so in national restoration? Do we assume that the Deuteronomic covenant and Israelite restoration eschatology are a part of even First Enoch's underlying commitments, but not addressed directly because of the book's literary setting? Or apart from the animal apocalypse, could First Enoch be representative of one stream or a collection of streams of Judaism in which eschatology is not linked to national restoration, at least not primarily, but instead to the more universal restoration of the earth itself, which has been corrupted by the fallen watchers? My mind is not yet made up on this question, and I would value further conversation with Jason and all of you here in a few moments. To conclude, I want to talk a little bit about how this book, The Idea of Israel, is important not just to our work as scholars, but also, I think, our work as teaching students in introductory courses. As I read this book, I took note of the way my own teaching practice might change as a result of Jason's eye-opening framing of Second Temple literature. I'm wondering, in my intro courses, how much time am I devoting to exploring rivalries and animosities between the divided kingdoms? Once the North falls, in what ways do I mention Israel in the rest of the course? Do I accept and promulgate the biases of the Bible that privilege the Southern perspective? Do I use adjectives like post-exilic? And if so, what do I mean? And when do I start using that term? And when do I stop? Do I ever resist the temptation to tell the story of the Second Temple as a happy ending? How much time do I make for the more complicated story of an incomplete restoration and an ongoing exile? Speaking personally, having read this book will change my teaching around exile, particularly the kind of affect, I think, that I have around it. I think I will now encounter and invite my students to encounter Second Temple texts with a new appreciation for the kind of tender, incessant longing they exhibit for the lost parts of their historical community and theological heritage. As modern readers, we can experience the intensity of this textual longing for reunion with impossibly scattered ancestors. And as we do, we might be able to convey a new depth of the very human pain and alienation expressed by these ancient scribes, as well as a more profound, perhaps, sense of hopefulness in light of that longing. In the story we tell our students about the Bible, Judah is simultaneously part of Israel and longing for Israel, if we follow Jason's book. This is complicated, but very full of possibility. Internalizing this human longing for the long-lost other might also inspire us to adopt modes of pedagogy in which our own human losses and desires for wholeness are centered and welcomed. How remarkable it is that the Bible itself marginalizes the experience and voice of Israelites in the North, and yet at the same time, biblical literature also mourns and grieves the outcomes of that marginalization. Exiling a part of one's own identity can only lead to pain. Jason's book opens the door for us to notice and convey the Bible's record of this particular Judahite grief and to honor the way ancient scribes made sense of it, most often by imagining a future moment when their community and their covenantal relationship with God would be fully restored. Thank you, Jason, for such a gift to our scholarship and our teaching.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jackie. We now welcome Dr. Gabriele Boccaccini, founding director of the Enoch Seminar and professor of Second Temple Judaism and early rabbinic literature at the University of Michigan. Gabriele, the floor is yours.
Hey, Jason, you know, we don't invite authors to present the Enoch Seminar review if we don't think that their work is important. So the very fact that you are here, it means that I believe that this is a really very important work. I appreciate it very much. And I also share your main point that we need to make a clear distinction between Israel and Jews, and sometimes we have overlooked, I mean, this kind of difference in scholarship, especially because the language that we use today of Judaism, we use the term Judaism as a term representing the entire religion of Israel, which is a quite improper use of this term. So I think that the central conclusion of your book is sound and it's important. It's a very important reminder, and you'll forgive me if I emphasize in my brief response some points that I found problematic in your work. First of all, there are some omissions that for me are very problematic. The first one already Jackie said, Enochic literature, which, I mean, I don't think that in a book on Second Temple Judaism we can devote only 2 pages to Enochic literature. I mean, is especially on this topic. So this, I think, is a big problem. I mean, because there is no reference to the Watchers, there is reference to the animal apocalypse, but not to epistle, not to the parables of Enoch. So there is a lot of material in Enoch that is not explored. Second important omission is Christian literature. Christian literature is, now that we are dealing with the New Testament within Judaism, I don't think that we can now write a book on Second Temple Judaism without including the literature of early Christians as Second Temple Jewish literature. I know that you are planning a book on Paul, which is fine, but this reminds me a lot of our friend Epicandus. Palestinian Judaism, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. First, we define Palestinian Judaism, or we define Judaism, and then we define, which I think was an important point when Epicandus did in 1977, but now it's 50 years ago. And we should take very seriously the idea of reading New Testament text, Paul, the Gospels, all the material in the New Testament as Second Temple Jewish literature, so as an important component for defining what Second Temple Judaism was. So in this sense, I think that I know there are some references on Christian authors, but not within, okay, your analysis of Second Temple Judaism. I think I found a little bit problematic. Third omissions, you wrote a very long bibliography with a lot of, but there are some important omissions. I must regret, for instance, that none of the work produced by the Enoch Seminar is there, which is, for me, is quite surprising. I mean, we have published more than 25 volumes on Second Temple Judaism, and none of them is there. And some of the authors, some of the scholars that are protagonists of the Enoch Seminar are not even mentioned, not even in the bibliography, even when they have published important works on the subject. So this I find a little bit problematic. Sorry, because I'm the director of Enoch Seminar, so I had to say this. Okay. Let's go back to Sanders. I repeat, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I found that maybe in the organization material is still too much depending on Sanders in terms of the organization material. Also, the stress on a sort of common denominator theology. Okay, try to find what everything is in common, not a great attention on diversity, okay, on the different models in which the relation between Israel and Jews. Let me be very clear. I like this book. I would like a second volume in which you tell us how the different groups of Second Temple Judaism were dealing with the relations between Israel and Jews, because this I don't understand, this I don't find in your book. There is a very strong emphasis on what is in common, not as much on what is different. Okay, the organization of your book. I mean, there is a first part, part one, in which is the introduction. Then there is a second part in which we have a restoration, eschatology, and the construction of biblical Israel. And that's fine. I mean, the emphasis is on the Torah. The emphasis then is on the prophet, at least as they were understood in the post-exilic tradition. And then we have a series of reference to texts written during the Persian and Hellenistic periods, starting from Ezra and Nehemiah, concluding with the Maccabees, and the analysis goes chronologically. And also is fine. Then there is part 3, Israel and restoration eschatology in the diaspora. As expected, you start with the analysis of the Septuagint. Then you jump to Josephus, and this I understand a little bit less. Why Josephus is treated before Philo and not the opposite. Because you say Philo is very similar to Josephus. Maybe you should say the opposite, that Josephus is very similar to Philo for chronological reasons. And these are chapter 6, 7, 8. Then I have chapter 9, Dead Sea Scrolls, but this is still on part 3 about the diaspora. Why? Here I'm lost. Here I'm lost. Why the Dead Sea Scrolls are in part 3? Israel and restoration eschatology in the diaspora. These are not words of the diaspora. Then there is the 10th chapter still under the same part 3, Israel, Jews and restoration in other Second Temple Jewish narrative literature. And other I don't understand. What is other? Other in comparison to what? To the Dead Sea Scrolls, to Josephus, to I don't know. I don't understand exactly why these texts are defined as other, and why they are divided between their pre-exilic northern setting or their Babylonian exile after Babylonian exile setting. For instance, the discussion on Aristeas, I think will have been very useful in the discussion on Jewish Hellenistic material, so more related to Philo and Josephus than in this chapter, as well as the discussion about Tobit or Judith will be very interesting in chapter 5, where you are talking of the literature in the Hasmonean period. And then a final chapter 11, Israel in Second Temple, eschatological and apocalyptic literature, where there are texts that have no relationship whatsoever one with the other. Ben Sira, Psalm of Solomon, Testament of 12 Patriarchs, Baruch for Ezra, Second Baruch, Testament of Moses, a certain important text, but I don't understand exactly the kind of rationale for putting this text together. You know, there have been many attempts to write a history of Second Temple Judaism, and following, starting with Nickelsburg, following a chronological order, or organizing the material according to the major streams of Jewish thought. Maybe following some of this indication would make your presentation would have strengthened the points in your presentation. But I repeat, your interest was not more on finding the diversity or mapping the diversity of Second Temple Jewish groups, but more on finding what is in common. And so in order to make your point that generally speaking, the distinction between Israel and Jews should be taken into consideration, and it should not be assumed that the two terms are synonyms or they overlap too much. And I think the point in this point, the point is well made, okay, very well made. I mean, but I repeat, I would like a second volume in which you stress more the diversity. So, okay, these two terms are not identical. These two terms should be treated not as synonyms, but do we have different treatments of the relationship between Israel and the Jews in the different streams of Second Temple Judaism? Because most of your chapters do not deal with different streams of Second Temple Judaism, but simply with groups of texts that are put together without particular ideological or intellectual reasons. Okay, and I hope in your book on Paul you will treat Paul within Second Temple Judaism and not just in relation to what Second Temple Judaism presented, because I think that with all respect with the hippie Sanders that we have all admired so much, we have to move on, I mean, and to consider now Christian text within Judaism and not after a constructed Judaism that include even texts that were written after Paul, like Second Baruch or for Ezra, but including Paul, the New Testament, the Gospels in general within this context and as representative of this context and of the diversity of this context. So I really like very much with Jason, believe me, I really like very much your book because I think that you made the point that had to be made. Especially, I think because we are using the term Judaism as a synonym for the religion of Israel in our common language. And after reading your book, I even wonder if we should continue to use the term Second Temple Judaism. Okay, which is very problematic. We do it because it's simple, it works well, but of course, there are a lot of problems using these terms, and we need to be reminded that the situation is more complex. And so I wanted to thank you just for reminding us.
Thank you very much, Gabriele. Lastly, we welcome in absentia Dr. Mark Lucher, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism in the Department of Religion at Temple University.
Oh, good. It's recording. Hi. Before I get started, I didn't put this into the paper that I'm going to read, but Jason, I wanted to say, and I think everybody who's part of the session will agree, that one of the most important things in your book is in the early part of your discussion, you talk about the legacy of anti-Semitism in scholarship and how that has affected subsequent generations of scholarly inquiry. And I think it was an incredible service that you've done to the field to model how to address that so effectively, especially given the currents of conversation we're now having about the ethics of citation and citing problematic figures, both alive and dead, in the field. So I want to thank you for that very much. And now I'm going to read the paper that I've prepared. So here we go. Hi, everybody. I want to apologize for not being able to join you in person for today's event, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to offer some thoughts on Jason's superb book. This was a thought-provoking study on multiple levels, some of which acquainted me with areas of study that I have not worked with in any specialized manner. That alone was exciting because it reminded me, as I think it would remind any of us, how enormous and even expansive our field is and continues to be. With work that sheds light in corners we often do not have the opportunity to explore sufficiently when left to our own devices. The reality is that we fall into comfort zones and find ourselves traversing familiar ground once again and again and then again. That's not necessarily a bad thing because I think a healthy intellectual attitude involves a willingness to revisit concepts we formed in the past in light of new currents of discussion surrounding those concepts. Very often, I've described my own life as a scholar as a matter of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks over time. And over time, plenty of stuff has just not stuck. And that's fine because it frees up space to put new things out there, even in the areas where we develop our specializations and familiarities. That's why I found Jason's book so stimulating. Its scope is comprehensive, but it doesn't pass over any issue lightly. It's carefully, thoroughly researched and argued, and covers the material in a way that any of us could read it and, at more than one point, take a moment and go, I need to think about this stuff some more. That's the sign of a meaningful scholarly contribution and one that has real durability. I'm especially grateful for the way Jason deals with texts I've worked with frequently and shows how they are part of a much bigger tapestry that, in the aggregate, demands that the language and rhetorical features they contain be reconsidered. More often than not, my reaction when reading the book was not to think that previous approaches were wrong, but that there was much more dimension and texture to the evidence that has long been in front of us. And frequently, this is because of how he treats other sources that we, in our often atomistic corners, don't think about nearly enough. I'd like to restrict my comments to just a few points that I took away from the experience in relation to the materials I tend to work on more frequently. But before I do, I want to note that the key to Jason's book, at least for me, is right there in the title, and that is the idea of Israel. As I often tell my undergraduate students, the myths that form our understandings of history and identity are not always narratives, but sometimes just the briefest and most potent of ideas or symbols or statements. And the book's title alone draws our attention to this. It reminds us that all social groups and organizations begin as ideas, live as ideas, and are remembered as ideas. There are, of course, tangible factors that make this the case, but those factors alone do not make the groups. The ideas do. From the very outset of Israel's historical existence as a group, it was an idea, evident already in the Merneptah inscription of 1209 BCE. We can never know much about this group that Merneptah speaks about in the inscription, but the inscription makes clear that it reflected an idea about how the pharaoh regarded Israel. Agrarian in orientation but amorphous in geographical stability or location, tenuous in political and military scope, and perhaps most importantly, it was something other. other than part of the structured order of Ramesside Canaan, something conceptually distinct that one could claim to wipe out, but, as demonstrated through the persistence of this group into the Iron Age, something that would not go away. Israel as an idea stands apart from a familiar Bronze Age order, representing something else, an alternative, a para-reality. It is the idea of that para-reality that remains in the background of the way later writers conceived of it and, consequently, of themselves. This is the case at the beginning of the monarchic era. The redactors of the Book of Kings recall that following the rejection of Rehoboam at the Shechemite assembly in the 10th century BCE, the northern population repudiates the Davidic enterprise entirely by saying two things. First is, "To your tents," and the second is, "O Israel." The first statement highlights the segmentary lineage organization of northern society. They are defined by their tents, their families, their chiefdoms, or the memory of earlier chiefdoms. But it is the second phrase, "O Israel," that provides the motivation. Israel as an idea is other, something that stands against an imposed and an imposing order. And it is this idea that galvanizes the segmentary lineages to act in concert. It is not accidental that the earliest layers of the Exodus narrative, the charter myth of the Northern Kingdom, seems to have functioned as a metaphor for this Israel's departure from Davidic hegemony. Israel as an idea became foundational to Israel itself, something even bigger than the society that adopted it and identified with it over the next 2 centuries. I think this is important with regard to the through line of Jason's work here, because the different texts he examines all seem to recognize that Israel is something more than the sum total of its identifiable parts. It's not just a group or an assortment of groups, but a way of taxonomizing those groups beyond the level of history and culture and into the level of myth and cosmology. Much of this is connected to the historical memory of the monarchic era where two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, existed side by side for a few centuries, and the history of consequent thought regarding this era plays with the way this memory is annexed and applied, at times socially, at times economically, mostly politically, and always theologically. As Jason discusses, the fall of the Northern Kingdom did not mean the end of Israel. Different groups carried that identity marker forward, those who remained in the northern territory under Assyrian hegemony, those who maintained their identity in exile, of course later groups like the Samaritans who laid claim to this legacy, etc., but also those who descended into Judah for asylum following the fall of the north, and who thus had to negotiate their own sense of Israelite identity within this new context. One of the textual collections that Jason deals with extensively is the collection of oracles by Jeremiah, whose lineage roots are connected to this event. Jeremiah and those like him are former northerners, turned resident aliens in Judah, living in a landscape whose geomythology did not define their ethnomythology. And yet, so much of the literature we associate with late monarchic Judah is strongly informed by people like Jeremiah. I speak here of prophetic literature like Jeremiah's own written oracles, but also the book of Hosea, of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history, all of which strongly affected writers and thinkers whose lineage roots were Judahite in origin. If this literature became, as Brian Peckham argued some years ago, part of the late Judean literary tradition, then did the idea of Israel transform Judah into an idea as well? Can we speak of a Judah in the late monarchic period without the idea of Israel? What would it look like? What literary records would we possess? A few Lachish letters and various brief inscriptions, to be sure, alongside material remains of different settlement types. But we'd have little to work with in terms of a literary tradition that we could identify as Judahite, which means we'd have little way of speaking of either Israel or of Judah as polities or as ideas. Of course, we do have a literary tradition, one that is a composite of Israelite and Judahite traditions, and just as importantly, a composite of Israel and of Judah as ideas themselves. I think it is important that in the last few decades of the Judahite monarchy, Judahite society itself turned fairly atomistic, and our evidence, especially within the book of Jeremiah, indicates that identity boundaries were defined more by lineage and clan and less by corporate belonging within a kingdom called Judah. Recent archaeological work suggests that this is in fact a long-duration feature of Judahite society. It was a state, but not because everybody within it saw themselves as part of a cohesive or monolithic ethnotype. Even down to and beyond the Babylonian exile, these more atomistic boundaries persisted and indeed intensified, as Dalit Ramshiloni's work on Ezekiel, Haggai and Zechariah, and Ezra Nehemiah has indicated. It would seem then that Judah was as much of an idea as Israel for Jews living during this turbulent time, a mythological entity to which one might appeal in, say, the Achaemenid period, but also earlier, for distinct rhetorical purposes. So in addition to Jason's discussion of Israel as a larger idea of which Jews were simply one part, we might also see Judah itself, the namesake antecedent for Jews in the Persian period and beyond, as operating in similar terms. Not only because it survived longer than the northern kingdom of Israel, but because the events of the Assyrian crisis and later the Babylonian conquest so dramatically transformed the conceptual reality of its varied populations that mythological models were the only way to make sense of the chaos. I'd like to conclude by suggesting that if the very old idea of Israel transformed Judah into an idea as well, and did so in the face of the chaotic circumstances, then the idea of Israel and the idea of Judah are myths that factor into an earlier myth, an old favorite of ours, namely the Chaos Conf. We know from the biblical record that the traumatic ruptures of the late 7th through 6th centuries BCE were understood according to this mythology, evident in Jeremiah's oracles, the book of Habakkuk and that of Ezekiel, the language of Deuteronomy and the priestly texts, etc. For these writers, the Chaos Conf was real and pervasive, an ever-threatening reality that hid behind and even within the succession of foreign empires that came to dominate the region. The appeals to this idea of Israel and its subset, the idea of Judah, indeed interface with the eschatological patterns that Jason identifies in his analyses. But we may also read these as counter myths, not only of future restoration, but of survival within a mythologically inflected social and political experience. The persistence of these myths in late Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman era texts that Jason so thoroughly discusses are in some ways a rehearsal of conventions from considerably earlier times, evolving, to be sure, to account for the progression of history and the accumulation of new memories that are themselves made part of the growing mythology. I will stay true to myself by quoting my favorite Canadian band, Rush, who were in turn quoting Carr when noting, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And I think before I start quoting other Rush songs, I better stop here. So thank you again, Jason, for producing such a terrific work, one that gives us reason to think much more carefully and creatively about our own field. And thank you all for your time and attention. Goodbye.
Excellent. Let me remove my spotlight here. Thank you, everyone, for your reviews and this introduction, Jason, to this work. I really look forward to the conversation. If there aren't any other immediate concerns to address, why don't we take a 5-minute break at this point, and we'll come back, invite everyone to stretch their legs and join us for the next part of our conversation. Thank you. I love the shirt.
Yeah, actually, a friend got this for me, and I just it's too good.
Yeah. Jason, we briefly talked about this before the session started. Would you like to respond to the reviewers and start off again with the dialogue?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. There are a handful of things I'll touch on, and then we can get to discussion, which is really where I think the big value will be.
I agree. Welcome, John. It's good to see you.
If there are other people who like to join us for the discussion, please let Joshua know. We like to have a crowded Zoom, okay? A crowded room. I don't know how this is called. But please join us for this informal discussion.
Jason, by my watch, we've reached about that 5-minute point, and so I would invite you now to respond to our reviewers.
Unmute here. Well, first of all, I just want to express my tremendous gratitude for the depth of engagement and for the for not only the very kind words that all of you expressed, but also for the pushback, I think, and critiques where I think that I think all of you hit some very, very important points there. And like I said, I'm just very grateful. The most we could ever ask for as scholars is for other people to engage with our work, and the depth with which you guys engage with that is really means a lot to me. So thank you for that. I will address just a few things here that came up in those to hopefully open up a little bit more for discussion as we move forward. So I'll try to go sequentially here, but I'll probably put a couple things together. Al, there are a few things there that you brought up, and I think the first thing to mention is I agree actually that the Pesharim are maybe one of the two softest spots that I see in this in my overall paradigm. I think the Pesharim are difficult in general. And they're, of course, really present focused. They're, interpreting these ancient texts for the moment right now. And certainly your reading of Pesher Nachum is viable. I proposed a little bit of a different reading there, but I mean, there's a certain point at which I think that's hard to adjudicate. The place where I end up sort of defaulting for the Dead Sea Scroll group or groups, there seem to be more than one tradition represented among that group as well. I mean, I don't think they're monolithic exactly. Is I think we also have to read still the Pesherim, Pesher Nachum, and the rest in light of some of the other materials found there, like the War Scroll and others, where you do have this larger, more comprehensive notion of the restoration. And so the way I end up reading that passage of Pesher Nachum, I think you're right, that it ultimately is Jerusalem focused. It's focused on the temple. It's focused on following the particular halakha of the sect, and that things will be right, and it's going to finally be set right. But I think in my reading of some of the other materials from the sectarian literature, I end up coming to the conclusion that they associate that. Once that gets right and the glory of Judah is right, then all of the rest of the stuff with Israel is ultimately going to come around as well, and that includes that larger thing. So I don't know that we're that far apart on that, but I do think I'm reading the Pesherim with some of those other texts, and whether that's actually the right way to go or not is, I think, an open question. But that's at least how I'm going about it. As for your question, as for Paul and the resurrection of Israel, what's the connection? Are you right in presuming that the present book is a preparation for the new one? Yes and no. So yes, it is, but it's not only that. So these have been part of a larger research project that I've undertaken together from the beginning. But I really felt like they were separate points that needed to be made. And I didn't want to ultimately, initially I was going to have them all in one really big book. And I decided that it would be better to do this piece, which I think is its own thing and stands as something that impacts more than, say, Paul or the New Testament or so on, and has, a different relevance to more than just that. I wanted to treat this as that. And so, yeah, the next book builds on that. And this, I'm going to actually combine this answer with Gabriella. You mentioned you wanted to see more New Testament stuff and other things in here. And, there was a certain amount of pragmatism involved as well with that. So one is length. I mean, this is not a short book to begin with. So I was up against length, and I had to cut quite a bit just to get to where this was. And especially, actually, I cut a lot from footnotes and references in bibliography, which accounts a little bit for some of the oversights in terms of not having much from the Enoch seminar. I think I had a couple things in there, but not much. But, I had to stop somewhere. And same thing with First Enoch as well. There's a lot of unexplored material there. But what I tried to do in this book is to basically work through materials that addressed Israel and Judah. And the majority of First Enoch material, I don't think really does that. It does take a more universal scope. It's dealing with, the cosmos and the watchers and so on. And I felt like that would actually end up interfering with some of where, the unified argument of the book. So I ended up doing that, but it's the whole make one point at a time idea, which is one of my old teachers, made that point with me very early, of be very careful when you do your scholarship, try to make 1 point, at most 2 points at a time, because if you try to make more than that, then, somebody may disagree with point number 4 along the line and then throw out the whole paradigm, and then your contribution gets lost. And what I tried here is to make 1 point at the beginning, 1 point for the first half of the book, and then one from the second, and then not mix that up too much with other things. And that's a big part of also why I didn't put much from the New Testament in there, where a lot of theological stakes get in the way. People get very, very much attached to theological readings. And I thought a lot of that stuff would distract from the larger case here, but then I could integrate a lot of that with the second book, which is what I'm going to do. And you are absolutely right, Gabriela, that I will be in the Paul book, which I actually just turned in the final manuscript for on Sunday. So I'm frankly exhausted. I'm in that post submission lull where all I want to do is sleep right now. But that book is presenting Paul as thoroughly enmeshed in and engaged in these discussions. It's not Paul as again over and against this stuff. It's how is he working with and in these streams. So that's the aim there. And you're right also as far as diversity. You're right. A second or third or fifth book could be done on how different groups deal differently with, the amount of diversity in this period is staggering. But I did not want this book. I did not intend this book to be the last word. This book and actually the Paul book also is not intended to be the last word on things. I want these to be the first word of providing some new lenses to things, so that not just me. There are there's a number of attendees here, and then there's all sorts of others. Scholarship is building on other people's work. And what I'm trying to do with this is to try to give some new lenses, so that I think it would be great if somebody came along and did multiple books addressing, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And, let's look at some of the diversity of how this is working. That's exactly what we need there. But like I said, this is not a last word book, but a first word book in that respect. And your question of should we still use the term Second Temple Judaism, that was a discussion in the title, in choosing the title, because actually the marketing team, when we were discussing the title, the first title that they chose was actually antithetical to the argument of the book. It worked for keywords, but I ended up going like, see, here's the thing, like, this isn't just about Jewish identity. Like, the whole point here is that this is about Israelite identity, which is not the same. And so we had to work around that just to get that right. And I think that's exactly the kind of question. I think we should, I don't think there's a way around using that kind of terminology, but we need to be aware of what we're saying when we say it. And I think very often it's just easy to get into a rhythm that's different from that. And finally, Jackie, first of all, I resonated completely with your pedagogical questions, because over the past 10, 12 years, I've been trying to wrestle with this myself, going like, oh, gee, like, and so much of the way that I teach all of this stuff is like, each time I go through it, I have to revise, like, wait, no, you know what? I really need to go back and rethink how I'm doing that, because something as simple as like the Avshalom episode with David, it only occurred to me a few years ago that when he's sitting at the gate, he's sitting there and he asks somebody, where are you from? And then it says, when the person said, oh, your servant is from so-and-so of the tribes of Israel, he said, oh, well, if there's only, if only there was someone to judge you. It didn't occur to me that, wait, no, that's actually an Israel-Judah rivalry. He's suggesting that David is partial to Judah and that there's nobody to take the cause of the Northerners, which of course comes up in Solomon later on. Well, that teaches really well, but it didn't occur to me. So yeah. And as far as the grammar of that, and we need to talk, I want to get Gabriela on this much more than me, because he knows more First Enoch than I do for sure. But the question of whether there's other more universal kind of approaches to this, I'm open to that. And I think that that's the kind of thing that I tried to leave open in this book, that this is not just there's not a monolithic Judaism or Israelism in this period. And we need to be aware of that. So yeah, I think it's best probably to leave it there, but yeah, thank you so much for all of your engagement.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Reviewers, do you have any other brief responses to Jason's comments?
I have one very brief comment, because it's something that I left out. Part of what makes a book interesting and other people said it their way, and I want to say it my way in 2 sentences, is when it makes you think, when it makes you think of things that you might not have thought of before. Sorry. I tried to offer an example of that in my talk, but without labeling it. So now I want to label it explicitly. The connection between Tyson and the passage in First Maccabees is something I had never thought of before. And the discussion of Tyson in the book, and then going back to Tyson's article directly, was something that, a connection that I made that I had never made before. And as scholars, we live on connections. And that when a book encourages you to make connections, that is an important aspect of what makes it interesting and important. So thank you.
And thank you for that. And that article, by the way, by Matt, is dynamic. And I remember I was actually writing something on 4Q372 fragment 1 when that article hit, and I sent him an email saying, well, I was about 90% through with an article and getting ready to submit it, and you just did this better than what I was going to do it. So yeah, that's an incredible piece. And I guess one last thing that I just lost on my, I'll come back to it. Lost my train of thought.
All right, excellent. Brandon Black has joined us. He just posted some questions in the chat, and I think he's going to present here on screen. Brandon, excellent. Would you be willing to vocalize your questions, or would you like me to read them?
Yeah, sure. I'll vocalize them. I wasn't sure
Great.
my video was going to work, but so the first question I had was for the reviewers. I have also done some research like Jason has done, not anywhere near to the depth that he's done it, obviously, but I agree with a lot of the statements he made about what we see with the terms being used kind of synonymously, although there is some divergence, right? That we do see. You can find statements where people say, well, this is being used this way here. But in general, it seems like the scholarly community really still views, if you say Israel or if you say Jew in the Second Temple period, they really view that synonymously still. Do you think that this work that this work's going to be seen in the scholarly community, and that people are open to maybe looking at things a little bit differently than they have been?
I hope so.
It was mostly for the reviewers. I didn't know if what their views are.
This is one of the reasons we are presenting this book. I mean, to enhance the awareness in the scholarship community of the importance of making such a distinction. I mean, it's not that the distinction was completely unknown before, okay, but sometimes has not been so much emphasized as Jason did in his own book. So yes, of course, this is one of the reasons why we have organized this meeting. Okay, and we hope that this will help to develop a conversation also in the scholarly community on these issues, I mean, which are important. I mean, of course, the problem is very complicated because on one end we have the way in which these terms were used in antiquity, and then we have the way in which these terms are used in modern languages, which complicated the situation. And English is not the only modern language. There are also other modern languages. So the situation is as complicated as many languages as we have, because Judaism in English means something, and that doesn't mean in other languages in relationship to Israel. So it's very complicated. So, but in any case, this is an important methodological point, and of course, this is the reason why we are here together, and we're pleased that we are here together to discuss these issues.
Yeah,
John, maybe.
Yes.
I want to echo all of the congratulations to Jason that others have and not repeat all of them. It's a very good, compelling work. And the work on Kuhn's basic injection into in the 1930s. This is important corrections that we need to constantly be engaged in. My question is more related to what you said now in relationship to your final chapter about, I hear more about your welcoming the diversity in what you say now than the way your last chapter is written and the way the question is set up. By the work itself, we only have two alternatives. It's either Jew or Israel. I find that in itself to be a kind of limiting kind of category to talk about the diversity of both identity and of future hopes within the period that we're talking about. And so I will do the thing that I hate it when people do to me. But in the conclusion in your chapter, you have, it's more accurate to think of multiple forms of Israelism rather than of variegated Judaism. We could debate that. But I'm not sure that's the best phrasing of the question.
I actually agree with you.
and that concerns me about the manner in which we read and use your book. And also how we use the word restoration or future hopes. I mean, to be the third person to return to 1 Enoch. In the two apocalypses there, we don't have Israel hoped for. We have a new temple, or we have a new heaven and a new earth. One could put that kind of expectation on some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the central Dead Sea Scrolls materials as well. So I'm concerned about how we limit the categories in which we try to put the question of identity during this Second Temple time period. And also want to push a little further on that. Our tendency in the academy has been to ask, which biblical category should it fit?
Mm-hmm.
And is that also limiting our literary and historical imagination? So I think that you've offered a valuable corrective, particularly on how we use Israel and how we relate to the use of Israel and Judaism, even though I hesitate a little bit to say that Jew or Judah is a subset of Israel in Second Temple literature. I'd be worried about that also. But the bigger question is, are you creating a new category that ultimately comes out limiting?
Well, I think in answer to that final question, I think anytime we create any sort of category or we discuss categories, it involves limitations and limiting. And that comes with that comes with strengths, and then that comes with inevitable weaknesses as well. And in that respect, I think one thing I know about scholarship is that over the next, however many years, if people do engage with my work, the various weaknesses that are present there are going to emerge. People will pull on those, and hopefully that pushes the field forward and advances things. I think your point about the wording of that particular phrase is especially right, in that it's probably better to say that that we see a broadly diverse Israelism and a broadly variegated Judaism. And I do think that Judaism, generally speaking, falls as a sort of subset of that larger Israelism as well. But it's variegated in its own right, and can be studied and should be studied in its own right. But yeah, I think anytime we're dealing with categories, we're going to end up, I mean, this is the problem of map is not territory, right? I mean, anytime we're going to try to put a fit on the trajectory, or on the line, or on the data, there are going to be data points that are not adequately addressed by that fit line. And I recognize that, I acknowledge that about my work as well as anybody else's. And I hope that others can come along, and perhaps me, I'll in the future we'll be able to address some of those places where the fit is not perfect. But I think that's kind of how we have to take that. But I did remember the other thing that I was going to mention as well, and I have to confess being very much gratified by the mentions of E.P. Sanders in this at the beginning, partly because, I mean, I think some of you noted very quickly that there's some significant influence from him with me. But, I set out at the very beginning of this project as a green and, this much hasn't changed, rather arrogant undergraduate and then young graduate student, convinced that basically my aim here was to do something that would be along the lines of Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And so, and I modeled much of what I did in this off of that. And if you look at Sanders' work, there are a number of places where I think all of us would say he overfit the line. And there are things that, that's just, this doesn't fit exactly right. And that needs to be readdressed. But the thing that Sanders did is move the field forward. And all of us are in his debt to a great degree. I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with him back when he was at Duke, when he was emeritus from Duke. He came around a couple times, and that was very much a privilege. And having any mention of Sanders' work near mine is extremely gratifying as a result. And by the way, Gabriela, in terms of the organization, in terms of what is the other and so on, for a lot of that stuff, you're right. I didn't try to put it into streams because I'm trying to make a larger point, and it was just a matter of how can this sort of be most conveniently organized to make this point in the most pragmatic way that I can, that will work forward. And yeah, it probably could have been done better, but again, the aim is to be a first word here and to move the field forward.
Excellent. Al, did you have a comment? I saw that you unmuted.
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure I want to begin this thread of discussion, but I'll just say one or two things very briefly. I think Jason has put his finger on the point that models depend on the examples we use to construct them. And every model is, in the end, just inevitably dependent on the examples we use. If we chose different examples, we'd get a completely different model. Now, does that invalidate them? Does that mean that they are inherently flawed or useless? Not at all. The question is, what do they illuminate? What don't they illuminate? If they illuminate A, why A? If they don't illuminate B, why B? And that's how we can develop some sort of intelligent discussion in which we don't overstate what the model can do. On the other hand, we take advantage of what it can do and help explain what it can do and what it can't do. These may be platitudes. I'm not sure whether they are or whether they aren't. But in any case, I think they need to be put out fairly clearly. More than that, look, of the 5 or 6 of us on this discussion, Ed and I worked together from 1973 through 1984. We both had, for different reasons, strange work habits. We both came to our offices in the university at night after everything was done in normal terms. And as the only 2 people in the building, we sometimes spent a lot of time talking to each other about this or that.
So you guys are night owls too, huh?
I was, at least. I had young kids at home. I needed to get away from the family after dinner. And it worked out that after the kids were asleep, I went back to my office. Anyway, I don't mean this to be autobiographical, but the point, there's one thing that Ed said to me in those conversations, which I do want to repeat because I think it's important for what we're trying to put our finger on today. In one of those late night conversations, I had the nerve to say to him, Ed, I could fill this room with books that have been written about Paul. What gave you the nerve to think that you had something worth saying about Paul that hadn't already been said and that was worth saying? And he said to me an interesting thing. He said, when I came to understand Paul, and I realized that Paul was saying things with which I did not agree, that were different from things that I thought about this or that in the world, I thought then I was onto something that was worth pursuing. And this may be an interesting kind of check that we can use on our own scholarship. When we say things that are not points with which we agree, then maybe we have something that's worth pursuing rather than pursuing the things which we do agree, where we may be tempted to overstate things because we like them so much. Anyway, enough reminiscing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There was a comment in the chat. Let me go back up to it from Stuart Hantman, who poses this question: how does Isaac Oliver's recent book on Luke's Jewish eschatology fit your paradigm? Have you interacted with this work?
I know it, and I know Isaac and respect Isaac immensely. And actually, his Luke's Jewish eschatology very much is in rhythm with, I would say, or harmony with what I'm arguing here. And actually, the Paul book that I just turned in, my arguments on Paul they're not identical to what Isaac finds in Luke's eschatology, but they are very much in the same key, to use the musical example again. Yeah, so it's very much similar veins. And like I said, I cannot recommend Isaac's work enough in that respect. I think that work on Luke Acts is one of the best in the past couple decades. It's tremendous work. I also, Brandon, I did see your question as well, asking about saying someone had said my book was too scholarly for them. Is there a plan to put this material into digestible format for the average person? And the answer to that is yes. I do have plans, probably be another couple of years before everything kind of works out. But I'm hoping to get not only this, but also the Paul book and all of that into popular book, sort of trade book form for I don't want to say average, but for a non-scholarly audience. And then I also, honestly, right now I'm looking into how to get a YouTube channel and some other things up and running where I can do some video with some animation and all of that to try to boil some of this down into a couple, like into a series of maybe 8-10 minute videos, which I think would be useful.
Gabriele, I see your hands up.
Yes, I would like to reiterate something that I said before. I mean, especially now that we are all mourning the passing of Ed Sanders. Ed Sanders has been a teacher, a master for all of us. I mean, I also met with him several times, and my work also has been influenced very much by him. I said, on the other hand, we have a responsibility to go beyond Sanders. I mean, because we are all post-Sanders, okay? And one of the points is exactly in my view that we have a responsibility as scholars of Second Temple Judaism to include New Testament sources. I was also about to mention Isaac Wolf. I understand that we cannot cover everything, Jason. It's a problem we always have, but we cannot just because we have to omit something, to omit just Christian texts, because some of the texts that you are mentioning in your work are much less relevant than Paul and John in terms of the relation between Jews and Israel. So authors like John, Paul, even Luke, etc., but Paul and John, for instance, are much, much more relevant than some of the texts that you have included in your text. And I think Al is right. I mean, at the end, our analysis depends also from the samples that we provide. We are choosing examples, as I said. And in this particular moment, in which we are all engaged as Second Temple Judaism, to include the New Testament as part of Second Temple Judaism, I think we have special responsibility, okay, to include the New Testament sources in any treatment, and to do it without any special justification. We talk of the letterist, yes, we talk of Paul. I mean, we don't have to justify why we are including a reference to the letter of Aristeas. In this moment in which we are developing, and I know also from several people that are listening to this conversation, this emphasis on within Judaism, I mean, on New Testament in Judaism, I think is an important sign. Is an important sign that we should give anytime we treat Second Temple Jewish concept of Second Temple. I know that you agree, but it's important that we do it.
And as far as the Gospel of John, I also commend Christopher Blumhofer's recent book, The Gospel of John and the Future of Israel, which is an SNTS volume, which is working along the same lines as Isaac Oliver's work and my own work. As I think that's one of the best books on John that's been put out in quite a while. It's a really thoroughly studied bit, and he's actually building some on what I was doing here. He was at Duke when I was finishing up my my dissertation at UNC, so we traded a lot of notes at the time. But he also is engaging more with like Shemer Yahu Talmon in some of his work as well there, and I think it's a really tremendous work. And by the way, Al's comment about the data we choose, ultimately shapes the models and the outcomes of that. It's a big reason why I tried to be as comprehensive as I was in this book. Is the more data you feed in some ways, the more you can, the more you're able to fit the model. The downside of that is, of course, the more you treat, the less you're able to demonstrate the granular diversity of each one of those things. And I mean, this is the weakness that I think this is one of the weaknesses of this book, similar to some of the weaknesses of like Paul and Palestinian Judaism and the Judaism portions of that. It's not going to be, my chapter on the Dead Sea Scrolls is not going to be as robust as it could be as like a 3-book series on the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they're dealing with Israel. I mean, somebody else can come along and do much better than I did with that, I think. But and so the inability to be as granular is always going to be kind of the downside of this kind of bigger picture kind of approach. But it only works if the individual pieces also work reasonably well.
We'll next move to John. John, could you turn the volume down a little bit on your speakers? We're getting some feedback from you.
I'm trying to find. Maybe you should go on for a minute and I'll see whether I can get that done.
Okay. Al, could you unmute?
Yeah,
There you go.
I just did. Okay, at the risk of just of repeating something that I said before in response to what Jason just said. We all know that paradigm-driven history and historiography can often be a bad thing. When you have this paradigm in mind, it just drives everything into the same box and into the same corner. And that's why I think it was so important that we understand where the paradigm works and where the paradigm doesn't work, and why it works there and why it doesn't work there. But I'm repeating myself, so I will be quiet.
I'll pose a question unless, John, you're ready to hop in here.
Is that better?
Yeah.
It is. Thank you.
All right. Well, sorry about that. I was going on to think, and number one, I wanted to recognize that I immediately recognized, Jason, the similarities between the outline of your work and Sanders upon picking up the book. It was immediately apparent. So I want to congratulate you on that, because it's an important model, and what you did with Kuhn at the beginning of that made that parallel apparent. I rather want to pick up on Al's and do a little more thinking about the limitations. You mentioned ultimately that Israel is a theological category. But we're not only talking about theology, we're also talking about identity. And so the question about whether a theological category in itself can play the weight that you seem to imply Israel might, when it doesn't have a kind of a grounded piece to it. Here I'm thinking, for example, of, and I noticed that Joshua earlier posted that that next year we'll do a discussion about Jonathan Adler's new book. It would be really valuable to have a discussion. I've read most of that already, and it would be really valuable to have a discussion comparing your two approaches, where he's very much integrating the literary record with the archaeological record. And so there's a materiality to his use of the discussion of the origins of Judaism that is much harder to grasp in terms of the way that you're talking about Israel and the weight that you seem to be placing on this model. And I think the discussion between those two models would be of great interest.
I agree. I think also Fleming, Daniel Fleming's work on Israel, which also incorporates on ancient Israel, which also incorporates a lot of that materiality aspect to that. And then recently as well, Andrew Tobolewsky, his work on the 12 tribes concept they're also, I mean, again, we should be engaging with those additional pieces. I mean, my book is only one part of this larger discussion, but as far as a theological category and maybe not having the weight to be able to carry all that freight, I think the category of, say, evangelical in the United States suggests that a theological category can carry quite a bit of weight, and actually function as its own sort of quasi ethnicity in the way that this sort of works, and that's a pretty new theological identity, as it were. You know, it's younger than the United States, which is rather young on that side of things. So yeah, that I think when I say that it's always a theological category, I'm not saying that there are no other aspects to it. In fact, part of my argument, of course, is that theological category is fundamentally ethnic in its scope, or in its reach, and I'm resisting to a large degree the any sort of impulse to try to pull those threads apart. That, you know, when we're talking theological, then that means that we're not talking about ethnicity, and when we're talking about ethnicity, it's not theological, and so on. I just don't think that really is how things work, even today, let alone in the ancient world. So you know, again, this is a problem of categories, and it's part of what I critiqued in the first chapter of this book, about a lot of the discussions about Jew versus Judean and some of those things, where you have people that have argued, without, you know, with some merit, that the translation of, say, Judaios as Jew carries a number of downsides. And so they've tried to say, well, let's sort this so that we're talking about ethnicity, because in the ancient world it's ethnicity. But the problem is then that applies a category that's a second level category to something that doesn't really fit so well. So yeah, I'm now talking a little bit in circles, so I'll just stop.
We have another question from Gregory Bloomquist, and he asks, can the trajectory that you, Jason, identified be found in rabbinic and then into medieval Jewish materials?
I had a chapter on rabbinic materials that got cut. So yeah.
Would you like to say a little bit more about that cut material?
Yeah, at the risk of dipping my toes into water where I am significantly less an expert, where, you know, rabbinic Judaism and that whole world of rabbinic materials is just incredibly diverse, and requires its own expertise that I'm very cautious about wading into that. At the risk of dipping my toes in there are at least traditions that do suggest that this trajectory is longer lasting and works its way well into the rabbinic era. But again, as with all things rabbinic, there's never any unanimity across. Like the one thing you can count on is that there's going to be dissenting opinions. So you get a discussion that's in the Mishnah between Rabbi Akiva, who says the 10 tribes will never return, and then Rabbi Joshua, if I remember correctly, comes back and says, oh, you know, Rabbi Akiva, you know, he left his, he forsook his love here, and, you know, then comes in with a few comments about how that's not the case, and then a few, and then in that discussion is also carried forward in the Babylonian Talmud, where the later rabbis end up agreeing with Rabbi Joshua over and against Akiva on this, and provide a number of different angles from which it must happen. But so there's evidence. That's just one iteration of that, and you get, you know, Leviticus Rabbah, Song of Songs Rabbah. There's a number of places where some of this stuff comes in, and you even see it in the Amida, where you have where, you know, the prayer that, you know, is still said and has been said for now millennia, essentially, centuries at least, has specific prayers for the restoration of Israel embedded in it. And it is a very eschatological set of prayers. So it's there, but it sort of comes in and out, and the amount of eschatology within rabbinic circles, I think, ebbs and flows, and you've got a lot of different approaches. So I would be very cautious. I think there's a lot of diversity within Second Temple Judaism and Israelism, if you will, and there's no less diversity across these materials, and there's significant difference there, including rabbis like Akiva who say, essentially, no, Judah has become Israel, and the 10 tribes will not return, and that is a live option within the tradition, though it seems to be a minority option.
Thank you.
Could I just throw in say one word?
Yeah.
Of course, the question about rabbinic and medieval things. It's not an accident that the late Marcel Simon wrote a book called Veros Israel.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I was going to say, I appreciate you kind of expounding upon this. I recognize it's not in the book, but it's an insightful question, and thank you for your response. I'm noticing the time that we are nearing the point of our 2-hour limit. And so, Jason, I'd turn it over to you for a brief final word to close our session out.
Well, once again, I just want to thank everybody for engaging with my work. It's the most I could ask for is engagement and serious discussion, and taking these ideas seriously and working and engaging with them closely. And you all have done that, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I also want to thank Mark. I know he couldn't be here, and sad about that, but his response as well was it was a delight to hear, and his comments about the para-reality and some of the counter myth ideas there were really, really, really interesting to me. And I do think that a lot of this, there's a lot of work to be done on the idea of Israel as a mythological idea when you get back into that, in terms of I don't think it's an accident that this developed in the context of Babylonian and Assyrian and Persian imperial myths, and that it's its own kind of counter myth in that sense. And I think Mark's response got to that, and I didn't address that earlier. But once again, I'm really, really grateful, and just wanted to thank you all, and hopefully we can continue to move the field forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Join me in giving a round of applause to Jason and our speakers. Thank you very much. I posted some more information in the chat about the Enoch seminar and our upcoming 2023 events. And so we invite you back for our next event in February, where we will be looking at Archie Wright's book on Satan in the Bible and early church history. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.